Okay, I think we'll get started. I know we'll still have folks trickling in. Typically, this is an afternoon event, and people are getting back to the office from their lunch hour or whatnot. So, as folks join us, welcome. I want to begin by just sharing with you all that first, my name is Ty Olson, and I manage and teach in our conflict resolution and peace studies program here at Cuyahoga Community College, also known as Tri-C for those of you that live in Northeast Ohio. Over the course of the last couple of months, since Russia invaded Ukraine, our program has been collaborating with faculty in political science and history, as well as other disciplines, both at the college at Tracy and elsewhere, to put together panels on different topics as it relates to the war in Ukraine. Today's panel is, I believe, the fourth or fifth, I've lost track, panel in the last 2 months. And our topic today is sexual violence as a weapon of war, looking at how sexual violence has been used during wars. We're gonna be looking at different perspectives, a historical perspective to an extent, a more macro level perspective on sexual violence in war in general. And then we're also going to be turning our attention to what's going on in Ukraine currently, and talk about what are next steps for people that have been victims of sexual violence. How can they be supported in the healing process? I'm going to turn it over to Renata here in a moment, but I just want to share one final thing as it relates to our Peace and Conflict Studies program. When we are thinking about the concept of peace, part of our definition is peace is right relationships. It's right relationships with others, right relationships within our community, right relationships with our environment, right? And in the case of sexual violence in its various forms, as will be discussed today and looked at today, that is not a right relationship, right? And so when there is sexual violence, there is not peace. And we could get into that in more depth. But I just want to say, for the purposes of our conversation today and framing it from, at least initially, from this peace and conflict studies lens, when we're looking to work for peace in our communities and in our worlds, we need to look at the various aspects of violence that are occurring and figure out ways to address them, not only stop them, but also look at the healing process after these atrocities have occurred. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Renata to introduce our speakers and provide some more of a framework.
Thank you, Ty. So I'm actually going to start today's session with a quote from Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt was a political philosopher who thought a lot about the Holocaust and why horrible things happen. And she talked about power and violence. And she said, power and violence are opposites. Where the one rules absolutely, the other is absent. Violence appears where power is in jeopardy, but left to its own course, it ends in power's disappearance. In our question of power and violence, we talk about nations fighting each other, but at the core, there's also individuals who are the victims of this violence. And the conversation we have today is really looking at the specific kind of violence that is shown towards these individuals. The use of sexual violence against any individual is not merely a violation of their rights, but an attack on their dignity and a denial of their humanity. So the conversation that we're going to have today follows this structure. First, we're going to look at criminal justice and the framework for understanding what possibilities exist for prosecuting this violence against humanity, these crimes of war. And Professor Milena Stereo will talk about this in the context of international law. Afterwards, we're going to hear testimony of human rights violations, and this is going to come directly from Ukraine, from Kyiv, from Alexandra Matvichuk. Then we're going to ask back to sort of the bigger question of how does this even happen? Sort of, back to Hannah Arendt and totalitarianism and power, like why does this happen in the first place? And for this, we'll go to criminal anthropologist and sociologist Rachel Lovell, who will answer the question, how does this happen? And then we're going to come back to the individual, and that's where we're going to look to guidance from Ashley Klein, who's really going to talk about healing and counseling. And how do we address the individual needs of the victims, families, and communities that have to be understood and addressed in both the near term and the long term for rebuilding? So, if war is inherently violent, what is the limitation of that violence? Yes. So we begin this conversation with Milena Stereo. I will introduce Professor Stereo, who is the Charles Amick Jr. Kathy Haltern Griswold Professor of Law at Cleveland State University's Cleveland Marshall College of Law. She's also the managing director of PILPG, which is the Public International Law and Policy Group, which is a prominent non-governmental organization. And hopefully we'll hear a little later more about what Milena's been doing with that group, particularly with regards to Ukraine. Milena is a leading expert in international law and international criminal law and human rights. She is one of 6 permanent editors of a prestigious international Law Girls blog, which again has been several very interesting posts with regards to both human rights violations, sexual violations, and Ukraine, and a frequent contributor to the blog focus on international law, policy, and practice. That's International Law Girls. We'll put a link on our page later. In 2013, Milena was selected as a Fulbright Scholar and went to Baku, Azerbaijan, where she had the opportunity to both teach and conduct research on secession issues related to the province of Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm very sorry. I knew that's going to happen in Azerbaijan. Stereo has also participated as an expert at hearings in the International Criminal Court, and Professor Stereo has served as the maritime piracy law expert in meetings in the United Nations with regards to the coast of Somalia and later piracy prosecutions in Mauritius, Kenya. Professor Stereo is a graduate of Cornell Law School and the University of Paris and was an associate of the New York City law firm before she joined the ranks of academia. Professor Stereo has published 7 books and numerous law review articles, the latest one being on the Syrian conflict. Thank you and welcome, Milena.
Thank you so much. It is truly a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for organizing this panel on such an important topic. So allow me just a few minutes then to briefly address how crimes of rape and sexual violence can be prosecuted in different courts. So as a general matter, crimes of rape and sexual violence can be prosecuted in international courts, and there are different types of international courts. The most prominent international court is the so-called International Criminal Court, which is the only permanent international criminal court, and it is located at The Hague in the Netherlands. Under the statute of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, crimes of sexual violence can be prosecuted under the bracket, if you will, of genocide. They can also be prosecuted as war crimes or as crimes against humanity. It is very rare for crimes of sexual violence to be prosecuted as genocide because, as a general matter, for a prosecutor to be able to charge someone with genocide, that prosecutor has to determine that the perpetrators had a genocidal intent to exterminate an entire group. That is a very, very high threshold, and so far we have not seen any successful prosecutions of individuals for sexual violence offenses under this category of genocidal offenses. However, crimes of rape and sexual violence are more often prosecuted as either war crimes or as crimes against humanity. So what is the difference between the two? Crimes against humanity are crimes committed on a widespread and systematic scales against civilians. And within the statute of the International Criminal Court, crimes of sexual violence can be prosecuted as crimes against humanity under so-called Article 7G. War crimes, on the other hand, are various violations of the laws of war. For war crimes to occur, one of the basic requirements is that you need to establish the existence of an armed conflict, which in the context of Ukraine, there's no doubt that there is an armed conflict. And under the statute of the International Criminal Court, crimes of rape and sexual violence can be prosecuted under Articles 8.2b22 and Article 8.2e6, both in the context of international armed conflict and also non-international armed conflict. And in the context of the International Criminal Court, which has now been around since 2002, so for about 20 years, we have two examples of individuals who have actually been convicted of crimes of sexual violence as crimes against humanity and war crimes. And these are the cases involving Bosco Ntaganda, who was a leader in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then also Dominic Ongwen, who was a leader of the so-called Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. And there is a current case ongoing at the International Criminal Court involving a defendant called Al Hassan, who has been charged with the crime of gender-based persecution under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. As a general matter, the International Criminal Court, since about 2014, has had a policy in place where the prosecutor has announced that she will prioritize the prosecution of crimes of sexual violence. Now, in addition to the International Criminal Court, we have had at least two so-called ad hoc international criminal tribunals, one for the former Yugoslavia and one for Rwanda. Both of those tribunals have shut down by now because they have completed their work, and both of those tribunals have also prosecuted the crimes of rape and sexual violence as crimes against humanity, and in the Rwanda context also as a war crime. So, but you know, the ad hoc tribunals are not as relevant for the purposes of prosecuting individuals in the context of Ukraine because they existed for those two specific situations, the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. The International Criminal Court, which is what I started with, however, is very relevant because the International Criminal Court actually has jurisdiction over crimes allegedly committed in Ukraine, and in particular, the ICC has jurisdiction over the crimes of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And to go back to this idea of prosecuting crimes of sexual violence, it is much more likely that those will be prosecuted under the umbrella of either war crimes or crimes against humanity. So at least in theory, the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction in Ukraine. In practice, it is not as likely that the ICC will actually indict individuals now, because as you can imagine, in order for the ICC to actually indict individuals, it would have to conduct an investigation in a conflict zone in Ukraine, which is very difficult. And then even if the ICC were able to, for example, issue arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin or other Russian leaders, it is extremely unlikely that they would surrender to the jurisdiction of the court. And the court, like many other international mechanisms, doesn't really have enforcement powers, has to rely on cooperation by various states in order to actually arrest individuals. So unless Vladimir Putin or other Russian leaders were to travel to a country that is cooperating with the court, it is unlikely that the court will be able to actually arrest them. But this remains a theoretical forum where these leaders can be prosecuted someday. Now, in addition to the International Criminal Court, we have witnessed numerous discussions in the international community over the last couple of months about the possible establishment of a so-called hybrid tribunal. A hybrid tribunal would be an international tribunal established through an agreement between the United Nations General Assembly and the government of Ukraine. And we have models for these types of hybrid tribunals. There was a hybrid tribunal in place for Sierra Leone, the so-called Special Court for Sierra Leone. There was also a hybrid tribunal for Lebanon. And we also still have to this day the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, which is a type of a hybrid tribunal that's prosecuting leaders of the so-called Khmer Rouge regime, which were in power in Cambodia in the late 70s. So there is a possibility of having a hybrid tribunal established. We have precedent for this from other contexts. And if that tribunal were established, it would likely be able to prosecute these international crimes, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and then crimes of sexual violence as basically falling within these larger categories of crimes. And a hybrid tribunal would also likely be established to be able to prosecute the crime of aggression, which is not as related to crimes of sexual violence, but would nonetheless be important because it would impose accountability on Russian leaders for committing this act of aggression against the sovereign state of Ukraine. And then the last possibility of prosecution is in national courts of either Ukraine or other countries. Now, if other countries were to prosecute Russian leaders, they would have to do that under the principle of so-called universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction signifies that for these horrific crimes, such as genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, any nation has jurisdiction to prosecute the offender acting as an agent on behalf of the global community. And one of the most famous examples of universal jurisdiction was the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann in the courts of Israel. Adolf Eichmann, as many of you would know, was a Nazi leader during World War II, had fled to Argentina, and was ultimately tracked down in Argentina, kidnapped, and brought back to Israel, where he was prosecuted. Hannah Arendt, who Renata mentioned in her introduction, actually has written extensively about the Eichmann trial. So Russian leaders, but also I would say Russian soldiers, if they were to commit, or those who have committed horrible offenses such as rape or crimes of sexual violence, could also face accountability in the national courts of different states acting under the principle of universal jurisdiction. And then last, but certainly not least, let's not forget the courts of Ukraine, which would obviously also have the ability to prosecute, to someday hopefully impose accountability on those who commit these terrible offenses. And last thing that I would just mention, and I know I'm running out of time here, but last thing I would mention is just, as Renata mentioned in the introduction, I'm part of this NGO called the Public International Law and Policy Group. Through the PILPG, we have just launched the so-called Ukraine Accountability Initiative, through which we're collecting testimonies of Ukrainian witnesses and victims of crimes using remote methodologies. So we're interviewing witnesses and victims using Zoom as well as other tech platforms to collect their stories. And we're then coding and transferring those testimonies into an electronic database and hoping then to someday transfer this information to one of these accountability mechanisms that I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Milena. And speaking of the investigations and understand, in order for these indictments to happen, we need to help to gather the information about these atrocities. And here to discuss that is Alexandra Matvichuk. Alexandra is a human rights defender who works on issues in Ukraine and the OSCE region. Presently, she has this human rights organization called the Center for Civil Liberties, and also coordinates the work of an initiative group called Euromaidan SOS. The activities of the CCL are aimed at protecting human rights and establishing democracy in Ukraine and the OSCE region. CCL is developing legislative changes, exercising public oversight over law enforcement agency and the judiciary. It conducts educational activities for young people and implements international solidarity programs. The Euromaidan SOS initiative has recently been much reinitiated by Alexandra. It began in response to the Revolution of Dignity, and since the beginning of this most recent Russian aggression in Ukraine has been monitoring political persecution in occupied Crimea, documenting war crimes and crimes against humanity during the hybrid war in the Donbass, and conducting a hashtag Let My People Go, and also hashtag Save Oleg Sentsov. And these are both international campaigns to release political prisoners that are detained by Russian authorities. Alexandra has experience in documenting violations during armed conflict. She is the author of a number of reports to various UN bodies, the Council of Europe, the European Union, the OSCE, and the International Criminal Court, which we've just been hearing about. After the beginning of a new armed aggression in February of this year, the Euromaidan Initiative's volunteers are documenting the events which have signs of crime under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. In 2016, Alexandra received the Democracy Defender Award for exclusive contribution to promoting democracy and human rights. In 2017, she became the first woman to participate in the Ukrainian Emerging Leaders Program of Stanford University. Alexandra is in Kyiv, and we thank her for joining us and welcome her to this roundtable.
Thank you very much for providing me a floor. It's a huge honor for me to be a speaker on this panel. I would like to share our experience of documenting sexual violence in the frame of war which Russia started against Ukraine. And maybe I will start with that point that the war started not in February this year, but 8 years ago in 2014. And since that time, I have been documenting war crimes in occupied Donbass and political persecutions in occupied Crimea. The focus of our organization for all these years was a practice of illegal detention, torture, sexual violence, and killing civilians. And I personally spoke with more than hundreds of people who survived from captivity, and they told me very horrible stories. I spoke with people who were beaten, who were raped, whose fingers were cut, who were tortured with electricity, who were smashed into wooden boxes, and other horrible details of tortures. And based on my own experience, I know that sexual violence during war is the most hidden crime. And people who survive it quite often don't report it to police and are not ready to talk about it, even with human rights defenders, because of their understanding of a rape as a shame crime. I have in my practice a case when people were held together in one cell, and first I spoke with person who told me about regular rape of another person, which he witnessed, and then when I reached this another person and spoke with her, she told me about different details of horrible tortures, but didn't mention about rape. So it's important to understand that this war crimes has a very hidden nature, which provide very difficult to investigate and bring perpetrators to justice. After the full-scale Russian invasion in February started, we resumed our Euromaidan SOS initiative and united several hundreds volunteers who gathered the testimonies of victims and witnesses of war crimes from all around the countries. And in our work, we received several cases of people who were raped by Russian soldiers in Sumy, in Kharkiv and Kiev region. We are not deliberately searching for such kind of cases because most of our volunteers are not trained to interview the survivors of sexual violence. So when we received these contacts, we work on these cases in close coordination with organizations who specialize in this issue. But unfortunately, we have to get the skills as quickly as possible. One example, 3 days ago, I was contacted by one of our volunteers. It's a very professional lawyer with a long year experience to work in court in criminal proceedings. And he asked me about instructions how to speak with men who were raped by Russian soldiers. So we now try to translate it a basic guidelines which was integrated into international protocol on the documentation and investigation of sexual violence in conflict, because we need appropriate materials in Ukrainian language to provide and to teach our volunteers how to work with such kind of cases. And people always ask me about the number, but I can only respond that for current moment, we see the only top of iceberg and we don't know the scale of sexual violence in Ukraine, which is committed by Russian troops. And we will see more information only after complete liberation of Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia, Kharkiv, and other regions of Ukraine, which now partially occupied by Russia. But even that fact that our Euromaidan SOS initiative, who not deliberate searching for such kind of cases, got contacts of people who were raped, men and women, it shows us the scale of this legal practice. more information about sexual violence started to surface after liberation of the Kiev region, which was happened in the end of March. And in Kiev region, we work with the mobile groups and closely coordinate with Ukrainian Ombudsman office. Ukrainian Ombudsman, we called it Commissioner for Human Rights, officially states about mass and regular rape by Russian soldiers in the Kiev region. And she told that they received 400 such kind of cases. These rapes have been often accompanied by murders and by causing physical harm to victims, like their teeth were knocked out, limbs broken, sexual organs seriously injured. And unfortunately, children, boys and girls also fall victims of the sexual violence of Russian armed forces. Also, it's very important to mention that often these rapes happened in presence of victims' children, their relatives or acquaintances, and were accompanied by explicit demonstration of disdain of Russian towards the civilians. And this leads us to another very important conclusion, because when we speak about specific of sexual violence, it's a very like sensitive crime, which through specific victims directed towards the whole Ukrainian society, like a target, because from one side they evoke feelings of shame in victims, for another side they provoke feelings of guilt in those who weren't able to defend them, generally feelings of fear of getting the same treatment in other, and as a result it's provide for Russian troops opportunity to quickly obtain a control over the region and to stop resistance of locals. So our conclusion is that sexual violence is a part of terror, which is used as a method of Russian warfare in order to break the non-violent resistance and establish control over the region. And last minute of my speech, I would like to tell about the problem with investigation and bringing perpetrator to justice. I mentioned two obstacles before, like the hidden nature of this crime, and second, that we are in a hot stage of war and this crime is still committing in the territory which is Russian troops are present and no investigation are not able in this territory. But even when we will be able to withdraw all Russian troops, we as a national investigative bodies and national judicial system will face with a huge number of crimes, which is impossible to provide effective response even for well-developed state institution. But we in Ukraine have never luxury to live with well-developed state institution. We have a lot of problem in law enforcement bodies, in judicial sphere. That's why human rights defenders now elaborated a different models, how to involve international mechanism into the level of national investigation and justice. Because when we speak about International Criminal Court, according its policy, they will focus on only concrete several episodes and on top officials. But it's a question is still open. Who will provide a justice for the dozens of thousands of victims of war crimes, among them survivors of sexual violence? Thank you.
Nada, you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. So thank you, Alexandra. The biggest question as we listen to all these atrocities is how and why? What allows us to humans to do this to other humans, right? So to answer this question, we have with us today Dr. Rachel Lovell, who is an assistant professor of criminology at Cleveland State University here in Cleveland, Ohio. She's a sociologist and methodologist whose research focuses on gender-based violence and victimization, particularly sexual assault, rape, human trafficking, and intimate partner violence, domestic violence. Dr. Lovell is currently directing a large action research project on untested sexual assault kits in collaboration with Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office and the Akron Police Department, with funding provided by the Bureau of Justice Assistance Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. Dr. Lovell is also the principal investigator on a National Institute of Justice grant to employ machine learning technology to analyze the narratives of thousands of sexual assault police reports for signaling language regarding a victim's credibility. Prior to arriving at Cleveland State University, Dr. Lovell was a research assistant professor at the Began Center for Violence Prevention Research and Education at Case Western Reserve University. Thank you for joining us, Rachel. You're muted too. That makes two of us.
Sorry, yes. Hi. Okay, good. So thanks for having me on today. I think when I often get questions in the work that I do around the psychology behind offenders, and certainly that is important, or the motivations behind offenders. But I think if you take a larger view on this, really from more of a victimologist standpoint, victimology is whereas criminology primarily studies the offenders of crime and the acts of committing crimes, victimology instead focuses on the victims of those crimes and what are the theories and our ways of understanding the causes and consequences to the individuals who have been victimized by crimes, primarily violent crimes. When we think about sexual assault in the context of war, the research calls that either collective rape or mass rape. It has different terms. And it indicates that all sexual violence is rooted in power differentials, as you said at the beginning, as well as the exploitation of vulnerabilities, as an expression of power and dominance. So in the context that sexual violence is we often think of it as perhaps a misinterpretation of he said, she said, or mixed signals, or some variation of that. That is not the context in which rape most often occurs. Instead, it is about the expression of power and dominance. And in a society where there's massive upheaval because of in the context of war, you have what's called anomie, which is a lack of social norms or social structure for understanding that. So it's very important that while on an individual level, we may understand, we have a different cultural understanding of what rape is. And so the values around that change as that society changes and the rules of that society change, or there is no structure or there is no consequence for that. So in many cases, when there are times of upheaval, and especially in times of war, you are just not going to be able to hold offenders accountable in the same sort of way. They don't see the same sort of punishment. And the culture itself provides a different understanding of that rape. So culturally, within the context of that, the perpetrators of collective rape, who are agents of the state, is not only viewed as being okay, but also, encouraged as a way to ethnically cleanse, as a form of punishment, as a form of power and dominance in many other ways. So you see sexual violence perpetrated whenever there's a vulnerability. And in this case, the vulnerability is, exploited in multitude of ways. I'm not an expert in Ukraine, and obviously I will defer to the individuals on the panel around that. But the literature suggests that in terms of collective rape or mass rape, when it's perpetrated or organized, or at least allowed by the agents of the state, in a time of war, you most often see that around discriminated groups. So those that are even more vulnerable because of different aspects of racial minorities or other types of minorities, or some reason to punish those individuals, you'll see power exerted in that sort of way. And again, remember that although there's certainly ways to prosecute this on an international scale, as was mentioned earlier, these kinds of crimes are often not viewed by the individuals that are perpetrating them as if they're going to be caught for them. I would also say, as part of this, is not only the reasons for and the context for these types of crimes, but the significant effect that it has on the community. So these are long-term scars that not only traumatic experiences that produce long-term scars for the individuals that experience these crimes, but also for the communities that experience these crimes, for the individuals who are touched by the violence and victimization, such as those, as you mentioned earlier, they were able to watch or to see or to not be able to do anything in the context of seeing a loved one being sexually assaulted. But also knowing or witnessing or being exposed to that violence impacts everyone connected to the survivor, as well as the large, not just the sort of community, but the larger structure or culture as a whole will have this sort of long-term impact. And we see these long-term impacts on the public health of a larger community when you see this type of sexual assault on a level that you're seeing now. So not only what are the reasons for it, but really take into account the long-term consequences that this will have in a community.
Thank you. I think that really sheds light on the idea that a crime that goes sort of unprosecuted, unpunished is more easy to execute. But then we look at the side of the victim and to understand sort of what the process is of healing and processing this extraordinary violence is Ashley Klein, who is the Director of Services at the Rape Crisis Center at Medina and Summit Counties. She's a licensed professional clinical counselor with supervision designation, specializing in the treatment of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder due to experiences of intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking. Ashley received her master's degree in clinical mental health counseling from Kent State University and has completed advanced training in trauma treatment modalities. And she also has an eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy certification. In her role as Director of Services, Ashley provides leadership and management of all Rape Crisis Center services, including 24/7 crisis intervention responses, advocacy services, trauma therapy program, and often aftercare support services for survivors of intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking. So Ashley, we look forward to hearing from you a little more about how we can understand the victim and the process of healing for them.
Thank you so much for having me here today. So yes, the trauma and mental health impacts caused by the use of rape as a tool of war have the potential to lead to deep suffering across Ukrainian society for years to come. Trauma at this level of severity can create those generational traumatic impacts for Ukrainians at all levels of society. So women's lives and bodies have been the unacknowledged casualties of war for too long. And as we've heard today, there are confirmed reports of sexual violence being used as a tool of war across Ukraine. There are reports of children being victimized as well as witnessing rapes. And of course, sexual violence affects women and children disproportionately, but it also affects individuals across gender identities and targets those most vulnerable populations. And so the unfortunate reality is that we may never know how many Ukrainians have been victimized, as many cases will not be disclosed due to the fear, shame, guilt, and the potential consequence of social isolation for survivors of sexual violence. And the mental health impacts here are significant because they are compounded by the chronic trauma of living in a war zone on top of experiencing sexual violence. So the research tells us for people or individuals who experience sexual violence alone, that 94% of women who are raped experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD during the 2 weeks following the rape. and 30% of women report symptoms of PTSD continue 9 months after the rape. So these symptoms, these mental health impacts can continue for weeks, months after experiences with sexual violence. And 33% of women who are raped contemplate suicide, and 13% of women who are raped actually attempt suicide, which is, when we think of suicidal ideation and behaviors, those are the highest rates of suicidal ideation among survivors when compared to any other violent crime. So again, these symptoms have the potential to be even more severe than in the case of, what's happening in Ukraine because of that additional trauma of experiencing war. And then when sexual violence is used as a weapon of war, there is the possibility, the inevitable possibility of rape-related pregnancies. And this also increases risk factors for mental health issues, as mothers and children who are conceived through rape are at an increased risk of developing long-term mental health conditions, as well as poor parent-child attachment outcomes. They may also be victims of discrimination and stigmatization in society, as well as struggle with identity issues in the long term. So as we've seen in other cultures, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, Bosnia, Libya, and Guatemala, where rape has been used as a tool of war, there is a strong social stigma against survivors and their children, even carrying names such as the devil's children, children of shame, and monster babies. So this is a very complex experience of raising a child conceived through rape. And again, it has the potential to produce ongoing mental health struggles for the survivor, as well as the child or children as secondary victims of sexual violence in the long term. So the needs of survivors of collective sexual violence may present with a complex set of needs that need to be addressed in the short term as well as the long term. And so although it may be discouraging to learn of these atrocities and the potential long-term impacts, trying to also remember that healing is possible when the right supports are in place. So first, whether we are considering those short-term or the long-term needs, it is imperative that all service providers and organizations start from a place of belief. So believing survivors, validating their experiences is key and at that foundational level. And then taking it a step further, making sure that service providers and organizations working with survivors on the ground are following a trauma-responsive and culturally appropriate model of care, which emphasizes principles such as safety, trustworthiness, empowerment, and really taking into consideration the cultural, gender, and historical issues that impact survivors of sexual violence. So approaching survivors with these principles is essential to providing, that quality of care and to avoid further traumatization by service providers who may not be knowledgeable about the complexities of this victimization and the impacts of trauma. So to assist with short-term healing, survivors really need first and foremost to be provided with their basic needs. If we think of the hierarchy of needs, those foundational levels of having access to safe shelter, food, and other basic necessities must be addressed first. This also includes access to medical care, and especially, for survivors of sexual violence, to be treated for potential STIs and the need for emergency contraception, as well as care for any physical injuries that may exist. So that's really, the capacity that and the need that can be managed right now, as well as psychological first aid. And with psychological first aid, that is meant to provide survivors with coping strategies to sustain distress, address those needs again, and to promote adaptive functioning. So psychological first aid is not any sort of in-depth counseling or trauma work because that's just not possible given the situation that's happening right now. So the focus on it is really about those basic skills on being able to regulate oneself during times of stress and trauma, and it is purely about survival. So in the long term then, trauma responsive mental health services must be accessible to survivors. And this can be challenging culturally as there is some distrust of service providers and stigma around mental health in general. So it starts with that education within all levels of society to really promote and prioritize mental well-being and to provide those accessible services. And so then once you get into that type of work with survivors of sexual violence, there are 3 areas that should be addressed here. So the first level is that individual treatment. So giving the survivor that space to process the traumatic experiences that they've been through. The second area would be attachment work. So how to establish safe, healthy connections with others, or particularly in the cases where a survivor may have birthed a child who was conceived through rape. This type of work could also be used to address the parent-child attachment issues and to facilitate healthy relationships. And then the third area of work is that community work. So providing that psychoeducation on sexual violence to destigmatize survivors who are experiencing this right now, as well as their children who were conceived through rape. And this psychoeducation needs to happen at a systems level, down to service providers and to individual members of society in order to combat that social isolation that survivors may face. And there are some organizations providing assistance to address some of these needs right now. So the basic needs, as well as the mental health and emotional support. The Trauma Resource Institute is providing psychoeducation through telehealth platforms at no cost to survivors in Ukraine. The La Strada International organization is an anti-trafficking organization that is providing emotional support for survivors affected by this collective form of sexual violence. International Planned Parenthood is attempting and trying the best they can to distribute kits to survivors of sexual violence with emergency contraception, antibiotics, and prophylactics for disease prevention. But logistically, it's been hard to, get those into the hands of those who need them. So any support for these organizations and their efforts are all things that, we could look into as individuals in our positions right now. So while it can feel hopeless to sit with the effects of trauma and sexual violence, again, please know that there is hope. Human beings are resilient. Survivors of sexual violence are especially resilient. And there is this concept of neuroplasticity in the brain that tells us that although trauma can impact our neurobiology, when healing and proper supports are in place, they also have the ability to rewire our brains and to create new neural pathways that promote healing, resiliency, and adaptive behaviors. So it is essential for all of us that we, try to do our parts the best we can to make sure that the Ukrainians affected by sexual assault have access to those resources that are available to assist in their healing in the aftermath of trauma and sexual violence during this war.
Thank you, Ashley. We will be moving into some question and answers because as you were all speaking, I'm sure that lots of us started getting questions for each other. And I think one of the most immediate questions that comes out here is the question, maybe for Alexandra, as we're hearing about some of the needs that these victims have, immediate, but we also hear about the investigations that are happening. What we understand is that there's that frontline aspect of this war. And the frontline aspect means we need to have trained individuals who are both able to collect that information, which is the testimony that we can then prepare for the ICC, right? But we also have those trained individuals who can give these medical kits and help in the immediate needs that these victims have. In what you're witnessing in Ukraine, and I know that there's a lot of brave medics that are out there on the front lines, what is the possibility of coordinating all of this in the middle of such chaotic circumstances?
We need very quickly to establish a whole infrastructure for survivors of sexual violence, which include cooperation between medical initiatives, psychological initiatives, laws initiatives. And yes, we need to educate more our lawyers, our investigators, our judges, how to work with gender-based violence. And this infrastructure wasn't exist before large-scale invasion, and now trying emerged in very rapidly in this intensive cooperation between different organizations which work with sexual violence now in this war. For our side, we as a Euromaidan SOS made a special memo for survivors of sexual violence, and we include in this memo the contacts of different medical, psychological, and law initiatives for whom people can apply even anonymously in confidential way to get assistance what they need. Also in this memo, we put information how people who are close to survivors of sexual violence have to behave, because sometimes some necessity steps with the permission of survivors of sexual violence can be done by these more proactive people who for whom these survivors trust. And the most sad part of our memo, for me especially, is part which was prepared by Ukrainian gynecologists. I will remind you that we have a part of territory under Russian occupation, a part of territory where still hostilities is going on, and this we can predict that such kind of crimes are happening. And on this territory, Ukrainian citizens have no ability to apply for assistance, even for medical professional assistance. So this part, which was written by Ukrainian gynecologists, is about how to provide help to yourself if you have no possibility to reach a doctor, how to treat trauma on genitalia, how to try to avoid diseases, etc., etc.
Thank you. And I think that another question that comes out from the whole idea of prosecuting, I want to take it back to the very beginning with Milena. You had mentioned the idea of jurisdiction and whether or not President Putin would be able to be prosecuted at all, if he would even, show up to court. But the question is, we know for a fact that President Putin isn't, there on the ground committing these rapes. So can you explain to us sort of how the accountability is really distributed between those who perpetrate this, the rape, and those in power when it's happening?
Thank you, Renata, and that's actually an excellent question. Most individuals who are prosecuted in these international tribunals, whether it's the International Criminal Court or these country-specific tribunals like the Rwanda or Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, Lebanon tribunals, are actually leaders. Most of these tribunals are prosecuting those most responsible for the offenses that took place, and the specific mode of liability that these country leaders or military commanders tend to be prosecuted is called command responsibility. So this mode of liability, command responsibility, means that if you were a superior and you had subordinates under you, acting under you, you have a duty to essentially prevent them from committing atrocities. You have a duty to train them. You have a duty to supervise them. And if you fail in that duty, you can actually face liability for the acts committed by your subordinates. So a country leader or a military commander can absolutely be prosecuted for acts of rape or sexual violence committed by his subordinates. I'm going to say his because most of these perpetrators, at least in the command capacity, tend to be men. So it is not, these tribunals are absolutely going after the country leaders, the military commanders, the generals, as opposed to prosecuting the foot soldiers who actually commit the atrocities. That is not to say that the foot soldiers should not be prosecuted, but that is just to explain that these international tribunals, at least, are set up with this mandate to prosecute only those most responsible and have limited budgets and limited investigative capacities, and so cannot go after everybody, but prioritize going after those most responsible.
So thank you, Milena, for that. And moving on to sort of this collective responsibility, I wanted to ask Rachel about this whole idea of, collective rape and this anime that you have this lack of social norms or structure at one particular point in time. But then we have the afterwards, right? And so just like the victims have the afterwards and the society has the afterwards, how do we as humans and how do the perpetrators go back into the societies from which they came from, where those previous norms or different norms existed, and how do they continue, how does this impact their lives there, and how psychologically do they really differentiate between these two different existences?
Well, the research is pretty clear that even in cases not in times of collective war or mass rape, that sexual perpetrators very rarely acknowledge what they did as rape. They very rarely take responsibility for their actions. And in fact, there's been interesting studies showing how different, for example, people who are murderers are much more likely to take responsibility for the behaviors and actions and see those actions as being wrong, and that the actions that they did that led to the crimes being their responsibility. So and so that's true for the vast majority of rapists to begin with, that there's very rarely do they take responsibility or see that. And I think to some extent that's because there's this ability to want to differentiate themselves from what they think a rapist is, even in instances where it's very obviously a rape, where there's no gray area. It's just, it's just a perpetration of sexual violence. In these instances, we've always been able as cultures and as societies to be able to differentiate a sort of cognitive dissonance. So you can disconnect from what you did in this instance because in these circumstances compared to others. And so the perpetrators themselves may be less likely to see themselves as a rapist, see themselves as someone who was doing that. Instead, they're contextualizing it within the time and space and the culture in which that was deemed as being acceptable or okay. I'm not saying it is acceptable or okay, but when everyone else is raping, when it's being encouraged by those in leadership, when it's acceptable form of punishment or violence or control, or the sort of thoughts of being like spoils of war, not to speak to about the victims in such a cold way, but I think that from a perpetrator's standpoint, that's often where it's coming from. These are the spoils of war. So just as if their ability to steal and take items from individuals in times of war, so should they be able to take whatever they want from the most vulnerable, and that often includes sexual violence. So I think that idea, it is all very culturally based, so that I think psychologically going back to their homes and back to they can separate what they did then from what they think they are now, and not necessarily internalize themselves as being a rapist. And I think the culture itself may be even less likely to even see those acts, the Russian culture, for example, or the Rwandan, or whatever the sorts of different environments, is seeing those perpetrators as being rapists because they create a new definition or a new term for that, because it's like what happened in that time of war, it was all bad. That's not who you are. So I don't know that those are going to have lasting consequences for the perpetrators. But that I think it also speaks though to our ability to think of to work on reducing the stigma that the victims themselves feel, and taking responsibility as a culture for really being able to say, are we being as supportive as we can to survivors? Are we making this process as victim-centered and trauma-informed as possible? How are we as a society supporting these survivors so that they feel like they're able to be believed, that they can talk about these things? And because we know even in not times of war, the most likely person that someone who's been raped is going to tell is not someone in law enforcement, or it's going to be a friend, it's going to be a family member, it's going to be a brother or sister. So what can all individuals, certainly within the Ukrainian environment, but sort of a larger environment as well, what are we doing about that? Are we really doing what we can to learn about these things, and are we going to respond in a trauma-informed way? Because that certainly has a traumatic and lasting impact on how the victim interprets that.
I'm going to yield the floor to Ty in a minute, but I have a question that links up directly from what you just said for Rachel, because it's that question of believing the victim. And Rachel, you were talking about the fact that, number one, we just have to believe what they tell us, whatever they say. And one of the things that we've seen that's been very predominant now is from the Russian government's narrative is to cause doubt and disbelief, and very much what's in the media to say, well, that's fake news, or that's untrue, or this or that. And what it really leads to is this just sense of doubt and disbelief that everybody is getting trained for when they read these accounts. And my question is, what happens to the victim when they are persistently doubted and disbelieved? Do they actually process, how do they process that? Do they actually start considering themselves not the victim, but have perhaps maybe they caused it? What are the results of that disbelief for the victim?
I think I mean, disbelief is one of the main reasons why victims across the spectrum, especially in a U.S. context, don't report sexual violence. And I think, Ashley, I'll defer to you as being, certainly you have the expertise in in therapy, so what it does for the individual for that instance. But I would also say for a collective group, there's strong research to suggest that trauma on this scale can impact your genes in the most profound way. So certainly the psychology of individuals, but it can also affect how our genes work, and as children who are exposed to this, the long-term consequences for the health of the individuals that experience it, but also for the culture that experience this. So certainly I think that's a great question, and I think Ashley it's better to talk about the individual, but as a collective, to also speak to the fact that when the collective doesn't allow those individuals to speak about their pain, to speak about what happened to them, it becomes one of those open secrets. And as we see what happened with Larry Nassar, with all the, with Bill Cosby and all these sorts of things, those were open secrets. Cultures knew, we knew these atrocities were going on, and we allowed those things to happen. So I think certainly the collective has a responsibility for that, because if we don't believe survivors, we're setting ourselves up for generations of survivors to not be supported. And we know that happens. Long-term consequences for the individuals, for how they parent their kids, to how they interact in the world. So I'll heed the floor to Ashley to talk about the individual.
Thanks.
Sure. Yep. And you're hitting on it perfectly. When survivors don't have that validation or that belief or that support, there's no choice for them but to internalize it and to shut down and to keep all of that inside. So what that looks like then to everyone else in the world around them is, we may see them struggle with long-term mental health issues. They may have trouble functioning day to day as far as work, school, household just daily responsibilities. This is where we see a lot of substance use and that strong correlation to traumatic experiences and not having that outlet to fully process them. People have to turn to some sort of mechanism to cope with that emotional pain. So that's where we see that strong tie to alcohol and drug use. And then on the flip side, you know, there's also those people that go towards like perfectionism and constantly working to avoid what they've been through. We see impaired relationships with either future intimate partners or family members, friends, even their own children. And then, you know, there is also that very real possibility of having physical health complications down the line as well because of the impacts of trauma. So it is extremely important that survivors are believed and are validated and have that outlet and that safe environment to talk to someone about what they've experienced.
Go ahead, Ty.
Excellent. Thank you all. And this is just, I think, as someone that is fairly familiar with some of what we're talking about here today, um, it, it just reminds me, though, again, how complex and how like these crimes against an individual have a ripple effect on a community, right? And when it's happening at a large scale, it has a ripple effect on the society, not just for in the present moment, but for years to come and potentially for generations to come, right? Which brings to mind why it's really important to become educated on it, and also, you know, I commend those of you that are doing work to address this right now. One of the questions that came up in the Q&A from the participants asks, you know, for Ukrainian refugees and victims of sexual assault, and especially those that are trying to figure out emergency contraception. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to rephrase this question a little bit, and then one of the person that asked the question asks, how do refugees deal with these situations in areas where it might not be legal to have an abortion? I believe in Poland was referenced specifically. I believe in Poland there are certain cases where abortions are allowed, and in the case of a crime or in a case of a health risk to the mother, abortions are allowed. But Alexandria, would you be able to speak to that from your perspective, and then others chime in accordingly?
So I will, because it's a real problem. We face with one single case when women who were raped by Russian soldiers and became pregnant, faced with a problem to make abortion in Poland. But this case was very effectively managed by volunteers because these women applied for assistance. But once again, sexual violence is a very hidden crime, and we have no idea how much people with the same problem can be potentially appeared in the Polish border and Polish territory, because the war is still going on, and the flee of Ukrainian citizens from country is continue. So we discussed this problem with volunteers in Poland, and they started informational campaign. They promote contacts of initiative for whom people can apply it even anonymously for medical and other assistance. And if they will need such kind of medical intervention as abortion, they will be transferred to another countries.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to chime in on regarding that question, and then I can move to the next one? So there's a couple of questions. One came up in the chat. There was also a follow-up to that initial question regarding emergency contraception and access to it. Is the question deals with, is this a human rights issue? Anyone care to speak to that?
So
Yeah.
just one thing from, and this is from a criminal and international criminal law perspective. Forced pregnancy is actually a crime in the statute of the International Criminal Court. So leaders can be prosecuted for, again, we're talking often about crimes committed by their subordinates, but leaders can be prosecuted for these acts of forced pregnancy. And so you might say that situations where there's a climate and culture created where women are routinely raped, not given contraceptives, and this results in unwanted pregnancies, that would be a forced pregnancy, and those who commit that act can be prosecuted at these international tribunals.
Thank you. I think that gets to what the question was asking. So I know we don't have a lot of time. One of the other questions that came up was, what is the most helpful way or thing that we can do to help support survivors in the situation in Ukraine and with Ukraine refugees now living in other countries? Is there a way that we can support from abroad, right? And so, Alexandra, this might be a question for you. Like, how can those of us on the outside be supportive to those that have been victims and those that are doing the work to support victims in Ukraine and Poland and other Eastern European countries?
I think that the most needed for current moment is to, if it's possible, is to do the assistance and documentation with us, because there are a lot of people who are willing to provide their expertise, their consultancy, but we are in work in pace when every day hundreds of fires emerge. We have no time for consultancy, uh, for like trainings. We some weeks we have sleep for 4 hours per day. So what's the most urgent necessity? It's send the special groups of educated people and to work on the ground. We had such experience when France sends the National Guard to work in Kiev region. They are not specialized on sexual violence, but they work with Ukrainian investigative bodies and strengthen their capacity on the ground. So I think this is the urgent need, which is very essential in this moment. But second, what I want to mention, that our task is not only to proper investigate it, document it, and bring perpetrators to justice for whole people who committed this sexual crime by their own hands, or their commanders who don't stop their soldiers, or military and political officials of Russian Federation who organize this aggression in frame of which we have sexual violence and other kinds of crimes. Our task is much more challengeable. We need to stop this war. And we need to stop the war crimes to commit it. We need to stop and prevent the appearances of new victims of war crimes and survivors of sexual violence emerged. And this is like a very challengeable task, which I myself face as a human rights lawyer, who now see that all my knowledge of Geneva and Hague Convention couldn't help me to protect people. And that's why when I spoke with policymakers from different countries, I always mentioned that we need have a heavy weapon like fighter jets, air defense system, tanks, etc., because we need to withdraw Russian troops from Ukrainian territories. And second, we need such kind of level of economical sanctions against Russia in order to stop the ability of Russian economy to feed this war. Because for current moment, according economists estimated that Russia can finance the social obligation between Russian society, their economy, and ongoing hostilities for 2 years.
Thank you. I mean, your point about ending the war immediately is important, right? Like this is, and the support that needs to be provided to the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian people. I think we're about ready to wrap up, and so I want to I'll turn it back over to you, Renata, if that works, and allow everyone to kind of give some final thoughts. On my end, I just want to say thank you to all of you who joined us as participants or attendees for this session, and also to you panelists for taking some time out of your busy lives to share your expertise and perspective, and provide, some deeper awareness around the impacts of what's going on during the war in Ukraine. And hopefully, those of us that are attending and learning are able to take something away from this session today, whether it's going and learning more about what is occurring and how we can support efforts to end the war, and support efforts to those that are victims of sexual violence, as well as just continuing to not continuing to be aware that this is occurring and keep talking about it, because I don't know about you all, but it's oftentimes over the course of a long conflict, people begin to lose sight of it, and then it no longer becomes important, and it doesn't get the attention it needs. And so just continuing to be aware and talk about what's going on in Ukraine from an educated perspective is really important. So I thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to pass it back over to Renata. Thank you, and thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Ty. And I think I'm going to wrap up with 2 words, genocide versus genocidal, right? When genocide is a legal term, and we know that, as Milena explained, some of these acts will never be brought to court under genocide because they don't fall under the definition. However, genocidal is more an adjective that's going to describe the desire to destroy someone or an ethnicity or a group. And I think that in the conversation today, we were really distinguishing between the individual experience and the larger destruction that is intended here. And I would really like to thank everybody for helping us frame this incredibly complex conversation. And I want to let everybody know who's here and who's in the audience that we will be posting this. This will be up on our website, which is dedicated to the information about humanitarian aid. And all of the information that you heard today about additional resources and organizations that were mentioned, we will be posting that collectively there as well for further reference. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Ty, and the Conflict Resolution Peace Studies Program at Tri-C for helping facilitate these roundtables.